So, Carl, let's go to your book, right? So, you wrote this Software Requirements Essentials. If I'm not wrong, you actually wrote the thicker version of it. It's called Software Requirements, which has gone through multiple editions as well. Maybe if you can give us a background why you decided to write a thinner version of that book instead.
Yeah, it was kind of funny. I hadn't planned to write this book, but nearly a year ago, I wrote a short article titled The Six Most Important Requirements Practices. Sometimes I just feel like writing something or get an idea. And so I wrote this little article. It was only maybe 12 or 1300 words, and I posted that article on my medium.com account. I have nearly 100 articles up there on many topics. And I was just completely shocked. The response to that short article was just astonishing. It's been read more than 18,000 times. The posts that I created on LinkedIn to announce the article have been viewed about 100,000 times with about 1,000 likes and many reposts. And I was just completely astonished at the positive reaction to just that little article on the six most important requirements practices. But that made me start thinking maybe there's a market for a short book on requirements that just hits the highlights. Because, like you said, I wrote this book called Software Requirements in 3 editions. The third edition came out 10 years ago. And that was a big book. And there are a lot of long, comprehensive books on software requirements and business analysis. And those books describe dozens and dozens of practices, all these things a business analyst or a product owner or a product manager ought to do. And those are all useful in various situations, but busy people don't always have time to read these long books. So I had this idea of kind of a paradigm shift, writing a short book that just skims across the top. It describes the 20 most important requirements practices that I think apply to virtually all projects and teams. So that was my idea. And, it was nice because the book just came out a few weeks ago. And when I held my copy of the book in my hands and looked through it, I realized that was exactly the book that I was envisioning last summer when I first got this idea. So it's nice when it works out that way and you say, yep, that's what I was trying to do. So I'm very pleased with how that came out. And I chose to work with a co-author. I did that on the second edition or the third edition of the Software Requirements book. But I enlisted the assistance of a co-author, Candace Hokinson, and partly because she had a lot of experience with product ownership and business analysis on agile projects, which I don't have. And Candace brought a lot to the table. She brought, like any other co-author, different experiences, new true life stories to share beyond my own experiences and what I've learned from other consulting clients. She has a lot of hands-on current project experience that I don't have personally these days. So she was helpful in making sure that the practices we selected as being in the top 20 apply to virtually all software projects, regardless of the kind of product you're building and whether you're following an agile or traditional development approach. So that was what we set out to do, and I think we did it.
Right. Just maybe to give some illustration for people who are not familiar with your software requirements book. If you compare the pages, do you know how many pages difference is it?
Yeah, it's a pretty big difference. The third edition of the Software Requirements book, which I also co-authored with Joy Beatty, is a seriously big book. It's more than 600 pages of content. But it's sort of had to be because it comprehensively covers the entire domain of requirements development and management. And the fact is, there's a lot of information. There's a lot that people need to know about these things. There's a lot of things people need to do, and requirements really affect everyone on the project, all the stakeholders on the project. Requirements is where their interests all intersect. So that's a lot to read, and many people have read it, but what about something shorter? Well, in contrast, the Software Requirements Essentials book is only about 150 pages long. It's about 1/4 as large. So obviously, there's a lot more information in the big book, and we didn't try to duplicate all of that. But we don't have as many topics. We don't go into as much detail. We don't have as many stories and appendices and all the other things you find in a comprehensive book. But the Software Requirements Essentials book is really an excellent resource for people who want to quickly learn about these most important core practices that can add value to their projects and help keep them out of trouble. And then you can go back to the big Software Requirements book or other resources for details when you need them.
Right. I had a read for the new book as well. So I think it's pretty short, right? Like you said, I think someone who likes to read can easily finish it in a day or two. So I think it covers a lot of essentials, just like the title, right? The essentials of software requirements, which we are going to cover now. So for people who are maybe a little bit of confused about what is software requirements, or they had been burned before about bad software requirements, so maybe if you can elaborate, what is a software requirement?
Well, that's an interesting question because it seems like there should be a really simple, short answer, but there's not. And I think the first thing people have to understand when they start talking about requirements on any project is that people have different ideas of what that word means. And so we immediately have an uphill battle because people, one person says, well, let's talk about requirements. And different people in that conversation have different ideas of what kind of knowledge, what kind of information that includes. And so I think people have to learn that there are different kinds of requirements information. We have to put some adjectives in front of the word requirements. So we have to think about, for example, business requirements. And to me, that's talking about really answering the question of why are we working on this project? What are our objectives that led us to decide that this was an important project to start with? And then there are user requirements, which talk about the things people will be able to do with the product or the solution, whatever it is you're building. But then there's other details that are the kinds of things that developers need to know about. They need to know about the functional requirements, the basic ways the system is supposed to behave under certain circumstances. And there's also non-functional requirements. A lot of people don't like that term non-functional because it tells you what something isn't rather than what it is. But when people say non-functional requirements, they're usually thinking of what are more commonly called quality attributes. And these are things like the ilities, usability, portability, and so forth, that describe not what the product does, but how well it does these things. In fact, we've all used products that did just what they were supposed to do, but we hated them because maybe they crashed too often, or maybe they were too slow, or they took too many steps to get something done. So those are examples of products that meet their functional requirements, but not our quality expectations. And then we have constraints to worry about and external interface requirements. So there's all these kinds of requirements information that we have to deal with. But basically, what we're trying to do is, with any requirements conversation, is understand a need and then conceive of ways to describe to construction people like developers what they have to build in a solution to satisfy those needs.
So I think what you said speaks true. Like there are many different types of requirements. Probably also some people they didn't have a chance to have all these comprehensive requirements. And that's why I think requirements sometimes in any software team becomes a challenge, right? So the software, first of all, why it was being built, right? First, it must come from requirements. But sometimes requirements is vague. Sometimes requirements is just few lines of statement of objectives, right? And I think that's where the challenge is. And I think I still remember in our previous episode, you mentioned that the goal of a requirement is actually to have a clear and effective communication. Maybe if you can touch on a little bit about this again, right? Why you think requirements is very, very important for clear and effective communication.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Henry. In fact, requirements are not really about technical things. Requirements are a communication problem, not a technical problem. And that's, I think, why it's hard, because rather than just saying, okay, we understand what to build, let's go figure out the right language to use and the right code to write and what platform to run on, all that kind of stuff. It's not like that. It's a matter of human communication and understanding a problem and exploration. If you go and ask someone during a conversation, what are your requirements or what do you want? Those are terrible questions to ask because nobody really knows how to answer those questions. And so we need better questions to try to help explore what people have in mind and why they have it in mind. And then we can use that information to conceive solutions, hopefully multiple possible solutions, so we can evaluate them and choose the most appropriate one. But that's why it's hard. And one of the results of that, or one of the consequences, is that it has to be done iteratively. Ideally, sure, we could just go ask somebody, what do you want? They'll tell us, and we'll go off and build it. And that just simply doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. And so, this process of requirements development, where our goal is exactly as you said, clear and effective communication. It's not following a set of rules, it's not conforming to some standard, it's effective communication. And that has to necessarily be done in an incremental and iterative fashion. And that's frustrating for people because you go and ask someone for information, you get some, and then as the business analyst, and no matter what your job title is, if you're doing this kind of work, you're functioning as a business analyst. That's a role, not a job title. So you go think about it and try to understand it. And then you realize, oh, there's something you thought you understood during the conversation, but you really don't. Or you have questions, or you realize it's the opposite of what somebody else told you the next day. So you have to go back and revisit things. You have to go down layer by layer to get more information and resolve conflicts and all that sort of stuff. And so that's an iterative process that can be frustrating for people who might say, well, wait, I already told you this. Just go away and call me when you're done. And that's just not realistic. So this is why it's a hard problem. And I think people just have to acknowledge the reality of the incremental and iterative approach and the fact that it's relying on imperfect human thinking and communication. There's no way around that.
Right. Not to mention, you also have to write it, right? Not just communicating, asking people the questions, but you also have to write it so that the developers or whoever in the downstream is able to understand the requirements itself and be able to build and test it, right?